Welcome to another episode of Sentinel Interviews here at the Community Media Center at the Access Humboldt Studios in Eureka. No teleprompter, no notes, just an honest conversation with the candidates running for public office here in Humboldt County. And with us tonight is Andy Caffrey, the only Humboldt County resident who's running for the new North Coast congressional seat, which will be up for a June primary followed by a November top two runoff. Andy, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Charles.
So Andy, what inspired you to run for Congress once more?
Well, there were a couple of things. On the issue level, it's a climate crisis. I've been working on the climate crisis for 30 years. CO2 measurements began the year I was born, coincidentally, and then I would later have as a professor the guy who did that, Roger Revelle, the man that Al Gore talks about in his film too. So I've known about the climate crisis since about 1980. And I've tried everything you could imagine. I've been an Earth Firster, I've been involved in electoral politics as a Green and in the Citizens Party. I've done media work, road shows, even worked on producing music. But none of that has gotten the country to focus on redirecting our energy strategy and our economic system away from fossil fuels and nuclear. Now we're at the point where half of Greenland's ice is sitting on a layer of water. And if that goes, we're looking at a 20-foot sea level increase. So for me, I'm arguing that there are thresholds like that we must absolutely do everything we can do to prevent crossing those thresholds. So my campaign is fundamentally about addressing the climate crisis on a level that's warranted by the threat. We have to do it in time, and we have to make enough of a change to prevent the polar ice from essentially disintegrating and raising sea level and wiping out half the area of the planet where people live.
Now, what can one lone congressman or congresswoman representing a pretty far-flung part of California really do to affect the rate of ice melting in Greenland, or what China's doing building a new coal-fired power plant a week? It doesn't seem like whoever's in there, Mike Thompson or whoever succeeds him, is really going to have that much control over that.
Well, I don't see going to Congress as simply going in and working on committees and getting laws passed on the floor of the House. I see it as one aspect of what I'll do as a congressman, a continuation of my toolkit of 100 different practices that cause change to happen. There are a lot of people in history who have done a lot as one person. I'm not claiming to be a Gandhi. But we have Gandhis and Mother Teresas, and we have all kinds of people who, if nothing more, draw focus to an issue or put it in a context or turn it into a meme that connects with people. So what I can do is raise a hell in Congress and outside, interviews, TV shows, traveling the country, to get people to realize that we've lost all of our other options for dealing with the climate crisis, all of the market options. It's too late. We were supposed to deal with this 30 years ago, and we didn't. So the only thing we can do is to move off fossil fuels as fast as we can organize it. And when I say as fast as we can organize it, I'm talking about something similar to what we did in World War II. And we had radical changes in society. Women went into the workplace. We stopped making cars for almost 3 years. We had an entirely different economy afterward, and essentially were brought out of the Depression because of this complete change. Now we have economic collapse, along with a wide variety of other ecological catastrophes. And our culture is essentially disintegrating. The Republicans are dismantling our government. I'll give you an example of a really simple example for them as a paradigm is someone called up Stacey Lawson's Community Talk and said that, do you know how many machine shop classes there are now in this district? 4. And there's 1 full-time teacher. There used to be 40. So what's happening now is not about tax cuts and taxing the rich fairly. It's about the Republicans are gutting the very foundation of our civilization. The very infrastructure is just disintegrating, and people are sitting here feeling helpless. So the other thing I can do, and the other level of this campaign, is activating the people to be agents of change, to become political actors, to not be couch potatoes. Politics is not a spectator sport. What we have to do is we have to come together in our communities. We have to figure out how do we design a path to get off of fossil fuels as fast as possible. I'm proposing that we do it around bioregions, because the only way you can truly tell if something is sustainable is by ecosystem. You know if you're overtaxing an ecosystem or not. So the people living in that area would know it and would be affected by it the most. So I think they should have the most say in designing this. But I think it should be funded from the federal government. So I'm proposing that by retreating the American empire, cutting back on the bases that we have in over 100 countries around the world, by ending the war on drugs and legalizing marijuana, and by taxing the rich, that we can fund trillions of dollars back to the states and back to our counties and back to our local communities to build an infrastructure, completely new infrastructure that is beyond fossil fuels and nuclear, that is sustainable, and that meets the needs of people as close to home as possible. I'm signaling the end of globalization. The fastest way you can stop burning fossil fuels is to not ship things like Central Valley of California salads to Toronto. And so what we have to do is learn how to meet our housing, our clothing, our food, our transportation needs with things that are either within our bioregion or in adjacent bioregions. So it's not going to be about every bioregion becoming autonomous. It's a direction to go towards. We're not going to be able to do that. There are places like Kansas can't meet all of their needs. You only have basically a farm community there. We here on the North Coast are very lucky because we have a lot of water, low population density, very educated and creative population, and we have a history here of being involved in determining what our government does and in community organizing to influence the government. So here we are in Ecotopia. A lot of the pioneering thinking on what we could do, permaculture, green cities, green plans, has been developed in this district, in Marin County in particular, and then we have Humboldt State where there's a lot of advanced tech research being done, energy tech. And we just have a number of people who come from the green and, well, I'll call it roots ecology movement. So if we can do it here, then we can create a model that other people can use elsewhere. Likewise with my campaign, I'm inventing a way that without the money of the millionaires, using cable access, using the internet and other forms of community organizing, that we can reach as many people in the district with our message as we could if we had $1 million worth of TV ads. And my campaign has shown that that's certainly possible. Because right now my campaign has only spent $10,000, yet in the polls it shows that I have 6% support. The millionaire Stacey Lawson has raised $500,000 and she has only 1%. So my $10,000 campaign so far for over 6 months is beating a millionaire's campaign. And I'm not a nationally famous activist. There are people who already have some fame within the left, people like Jim Hightower, Winona LaDuke, Aaron Brockovich, Bill Moyers, that if they were to run, it would be a lot easier for them to use this model to get elected. So what we have to do is start targeting the most democratic districts and then start running these people and running them as community leaders, people who come out of the grassroots.
So how did you become a community leader in the first place? The electoral math is important, the issues are vitally important, but stepping back for a moment, how did you become a political actor? What was your education and indoctrination process?
Well, it probably starts in junior high school when I got involved in the Boy Scouts and when my 8th grade English teacher decided that she wanted me to be the editor of the junior high school newspaper. And so I did that and became an Eagle Scout and then what they call a Super Eagle Scout because I earned 51 merit badges and you have to earn 21 to be an Eagle. And as part of that process, I was involved in organizing for the entire Boy Scout district, the Mid-Valley district. We have an annual event called a Camporee, which is similar, in spirit at least for me, as an Earth First Rendezvous. And when I was 16, for the first time, they turned the task of organizing this annual event over to the boys. Usually it was the adult leaders doing it. So I learned a lot of the skills and a lot of the patience and a lot of the resourcefulness that you need to have to do things politically by working in a not necessarily political manner, but in an organizational manner. And then in college, I had a radical professor, Will Wright, and he started showing us videos of all kinds of corporate horrors. Mostly, I think we started with things like pollution, things that I saw as a boy when 60 Minutes came on the air. When 60 Minutes came on the air, it was extremely cutting edge. None of this fluff stuff. And so I've been involved in the media as a journalist and now as a video maker, and I've been involved as an organizer. And as an Eagle Scout, I became sort of a point person who did individual speeches. I was a senior patrol leader. I got an Annapolis nomination and went there briefly. So everything I've done since then is kind of an extension of being an Eagle Scout. I'm not an ideologue. I'm trying to solve problems. And that's what my organizing has been around my whole life. What is a practical way of getting something done? And right now, what we have to get done is we have to deal with the climate crisis in time, and we have to make enough change in time. I think the two most important questions anybody should be asking now is how much time do we have to reduce our fossil fuels, and how much do we have to do it in order to avoid ecotastrophe? So really, I'm just kind of doing Boy Scout work.
And in the interest of full disclosure, I actually recut a video with my fellow Access Humboldt producer, David Gerizzo, where he used some of your footage to tell the tale of the whole pepper spray incident at another former congressperson's office. This was Congressperson Frank Riggs in his Eureka District office in the late 90s, where 4 young women, one of them even underage, were pepper sprayed directly in their eyeballs and some say tortured by local law enforcement. And of course, they won a big lawsuit against the county due to those actions.
Well, actually, the first bill I'm going to introduce is a bill that would ban the use of pepper spray, tasers, paint hole compliance, and all of the technology and techniques that are used to control riots. Ban them from being used on nonviolent protesters, period. It just cannot be used. It's outrageous. I know a number of those women who were pepper sprayed. They were no threat. They were no terrorists. They were an inconvenience. And we shouldn't be pepper spraying people because they're making things inconvenient for us.
I think the field representative at the time for Congressman Riggs, Ronnie Pellegrini, was on News Channel 3 saying she was so afraid she thought she was going to die because there was shouting and drumming and people in black masks spreading around sawdust in a big tree stump.
Right. Well, and all 4 of those people had gone through nonviolence training, so they weren't any threat at all.
So speaking of nonviolent demonstrators, right here in Eureka, we've seen just this week the Board of Supervisors here in Humboldt County pass an urgency ordinance on an emergency basis, 4-to-1 vote, Supervisor Lovelace dissenting, that effectively said they can't hang a sign, they can't have freestanding objects. I assume that means tripods on courthouse grounds are also illegal. Where does that fit in for you in sort of the matrix of where civil liberties have been going in this country in the last decade?
Well, I was at that meeting, and I spoke out against the bill. I think it's outrageous. I don't think you can manage free speech. And the problems they're talking about are problems that could easily be solved if they got a porta potty. That would alleviate the problem of people pooping under stairs and other places. And they could allow the demonstrators to go back onto the lawn so they're further away from the stairs. When I went there, I was standing on those stairs and looking around going, this is 20 feet wide. There's no one in front of me. There's no one intimidating me. There's no one making me feel uninvited. But what there are some smelly, hairy people over there. And some people don't like smelly, hairy people. And so to me, it's the same thing as the problem we have in southern Humboldt, in Garberville, with certain Chamber of Commerce types who are starting a new form of brutalism against the homeless, trying to deny them basic survival needs. Because they say, oh, if you provide them with, let's say, a place to relieve themselves or a shower, there's going to be a magnet effect. It's just going to draw hordes of homeless people to southern Humboldt.
And I understand the chamber down there, Sheriff Mike Downey, even Supervisor Cliff Glendenin, who's facing his own re-election battle, all collaborated in making sure homeless, even homeless veterans, couldn't be hanging out at the Veterans Park that are in Garberville.
That's right. That's right. So what they're doing is they're attacking free speech on the local level. I mean, we're used to certain kind of censorship coming down on the national level, and we're used to the mass media not talking about certain things. But this is really outrageous. I mean, there's a lot of lazy thinking going on, and I think because it's an election season, there are a lot of sort of middle-class values that the members of the Board of Supervisors want to come across as validating. And one of those, I guess, is hating the least among us.
Well, We're listening to Sentinel Interviews, or watching it rather, if you're at home on Access Humboldt Channel 12 or on the World Wide Web. We're here with congressional candidate Andy Caffrey, and we're just talking about middle-class values and, well, passing the buck. What you'd hear from the Board of Supervisors or from City Council in Arcata or Eureka is, well, we don't have the resources to solve homelessness, to solve mental illness, to solve the foreclosure crisis. That's those bad people at the state government in Sacramento. That's those bad people in D.C. not letting loose the resources needed to solve those. But then you go to Sacramento or D.C., you'll hear more buck passing, saying, well, it's not the role of the federal government to solve homelessness, or it's not the place of the state government to spend money on that when they have an enduring state budget crisis. Just yesterday, the Republican leaders in the state legislature were talking about more cuts to mental health funding in California so that they can prevent cuts to education. Which hand do you want to cut off? Where do you come down on, well, where's the money and why isn't it being spent on these things?
The money is in the hands of the rich. Are you telling me, I'm not talking about you personally, but are they telling us that in this day and age we can't have the best schools in the world? That America can't afford that? That's outrageous. We can't afford to have police or fire. We can't afford to take care of the disabled. We can't afford to take care of our elderly. We can't afford to take care of our kids. We can't afford safe communities. That's ridiculous. What's happened is the Republicans, when George W. Bush was installed as our dictator, stole the framing for all of these issues, and the Democrats have been cowards. They should have wrestled the framing back. So what I'm trying to do is wrestle the framing to where it needs to be, focused on the destruction of our communities, the economic draining from the middle class, and the ecological crisis. I mean, here's a simple number to consider. Back in 1979, the top 1% owned 8% of the wealth. By 2007, they were up to 23% of the wealth. And if you look at the graph, you see that the middle class and lower class share of the wealth just drains down like it's a toilet or a shower drain. And so what's happened is it's drained down enough that there's no longer enough commerce in the middle class and lower class to keep the economy going. And what are the Republicans proposing? Let's pull that 1% share of the wealth even higher and drain even more from the middle class and lower class. So what the Republicans are doing is they are literally destroying the economy.
It sounds like you're talking about feudalism. But can you really just say, oh, it's all the Republicans? I mean,
no.
The cuts of mental health funding in California started under Jerry Brown's daddy in the 60s.
That's right. Well,
that's who shut down the mental health hospitals in California. They always blame Reagan, but he just continued what Edmund Brown already started.
Right. Well, the problem is you've got a corporatist culture. We have a plutocracy in this country, which means that the corporations and the elites and the people in government are all part of one culture, essentially. So you don't have to give marching orders to the members of Congress to do what you should do. And the same thing with the media. It's like they don't question the water that they're in, just like a fish doesn't question the water they're in. It's invisible. And that's one of the things that I can do, is I can go in there and slap them around. My goal is, 2 years after I'm elected, to see maybe 20 Michael Moores and Amy Goodmans and Andy Caffreys in there telling the American people what's going on and shutting down business as usual. The teabaggers, without any real imagination, have gotten a lot of media coverage and have had a lot of impact on Congress, although we know that the teabaggers were manufactured by the elites of the Republican Party. But we haven't tried to do the same thing on the Green side. And I think the biggest failing of the Green Party movement, and I've been a part of it for 30 years, so I'm not excluding myself from that blame, is that we haven't inspired the imagination of Americans. We haven't shown them what the green world, the green political world, would lead to. What would it look like? Is it just a bunch of theory, a bunch of values, or is it actually going to lead to pragmatic changes that solve the problems that we have? I argue that it can solve our problems. My campaign is built around 7 proposals that I think address the most fundamental problems that can be addressed politically. And this is going to be the focus of my time in Congress. It's called New Green America, and see if you agree with me. How many of these do you agree with? Number 1, fight the climate crisis as national security threat number 1. Number 2, rebuild America's infrastructure around bioregions and sustainability to meet all our needs as close to home as possible. And that includes taxing the rich, Medicare for all, and an expansion of the social safety net. I believe that as we go through this transition, we're going to need national focus. We're going to need teamwork. And the only way we can really do that, and we're going to learn that from the Occupy movement, is we have to be in this together. Right now, a lot of the middle class people who have lost their homes show up at Occupy, and they're the people who were there before. The people that we label as the homeless, although we don't really call the new people the homeless. And the homeless people are there for these middle class people, just as they've been there for anybody else who, you know, is dumped by society into their neighborhood. But the middle class weren't there before their travails. And so what needs to happen is a solidarity has to build there. And I also think, especially when you look at things like the harbor shutdowns, that we have to bring in organized labor as well. So I see that as the new potential for organizing at this point. So,
is there such a thing as organized labor, certainly in Humboldt County anymore? I mean, you have a few government-oriented labor unions, but in the private sector, it's almost nil.
Right. Well, Humboldt County, I'm talking about the district and the country. Sure. Anyways, to continue, the third one is retreat the U.S. empire, use the military only to defend Americans and their U.S. property. Fourth is end corporate personhood. The fifth is legalize marijuana and end the war on drugs. The sixth is prosecute the Bush administration and the 3 remaining Supreme Court justices who installed him for crimes against humanity, war crimes, torture, and murder. And the seventh one is electoral reform, things like ranked choice voting and paper ballots, get corporate money out of elections.
Okay, so on that last point, you talked earlier about the failure of the Green Party movement. Aren't we looking at the death, not just of the Green Party California, but all the third parties in California due to this new top 2 primary system that you and a dozen other folks are having to go through the meat grinder of this June? Hasn't it set up a situation where there's going to be very little choice left to the voters come November?
I presume you're saying that because in November, if a Green didn't make the top 2, you can't have a Green in the November election.
Or a Libertarian.
Or a write-in, right.
What have you.
That's the point you're making about how it's harder on the third parties. Well, it's funny, back when I was involved in helping start the East Bay Green Alliance in the mid-'80s, we were talking about these things, and we liked the open primary idea because it meant that Greens could run and not be spoilers or perceived as spoilers, because when you have a Democrat and a Republican and a Green, and you know, this also applies for Libertarians and the other third parties, most people who support Green politics, if the race is close between the Democrat and Republican, just will not vote for them. And my campaign has been conducting polls since September. And what our polls show is that in our entire district, the new 2nd district, 73% of the people polled say they will vote for a Democrat for their congressional representative. Only 10% say they'll vote for Republican. And it ranges between 3 and 4% say they'll vote for a third party. So people have already decided that they're going to vote for a party. What I'm trying to do is take advantage of that, keep my Green politics intact, go into the Democratic Party not to join it or to become a Democrat, but to essentially bring Green politics into the conversation among people who call themselves Democrats. The hierarchy, they can go to hell as far as I'm concerned. I'm not doing anything to get any Democratic Party office, to win any popularity contests with the people in charge. I'm going in there to confront them, to challenge them, and to educate them as well. Lost my train of thought there.
Well, looking at those poll results is one thing, but if you look at the registration numbers and who is likely to vote, especially since it's a June primary, most of those kids at HSU are going to be home for the summer and either voting at home or not voting at all, probably not voting here unless they are super political and remember to mail in their absentee ballot 20 days ahead of the election right before they go through the graduation ceremonies of their finals and they skip town.
Well, maybe they could move the primary up a month. That'd be better.
Well, maybe they could, but it's not right now.
But the point is, I've got 6% support. I've been, until 2 months ago, for the whole first year, in 3rd place for the top 2.
Right, but not questioning the poll results as far as your candidacy versus Stacey Lawson's or Tiffany Renee's or what have you, but just looking at the registration, who's likely to actually show up to the polls and vote, especially since it is a primary where we don't have a contested Democratic presidential primary or a contested U.S. Senate primary for Dianne Feinstein, or really any other major contest where Democrats are in an internecine battle besides this very district. Doesn't it seem likely that with 8 some odd Democrats fighting for those slices of the pie and only 2 Republicans? I know I've seen at least one CSU professor claim that a Republican is almost insured to get into that top 2 primary because the Democrat side of the vote, even though it's a larger piece of the pie, even if it is 2/3 or 3/4 of the pie, is going to be so cut up into little pieces.
Well, I would say, where are his poll results? What are his numbers? I mean, there's a presumption that the Republicans are a large percentage, though a minority, in this district. But if you look at the results in the general elections of the old 1st District, Mike Thompson's victories, essentially Mike defeats the Republicans 2-1. And what's happened now is that you have 7, let's see, now there's 12 candidates. So 9 of the 12 candidates are from Sonoma County or Marin County. That's Bay Area. That place has nothing to do with where we live here in Humboldt County, in Trinity County, in Del Norte, or Mendocino. The median income where we live is $35,000 a year. In Marin, it's $85,000. We're effectively the 3rd world of the 2nd District. So what happens here, we have a much less diverse economy. Huge sectors of our economy have collapsed. I think you were at the Fortuna debate.
Right.
And the first thing I asked was, how many former Pacific Lumber employees are in the audience? None. How many former timber workers? None. And after that debate, the mayor told me that, well, all those people had to leave. There weren't any jobs. So essentially, Hurwitz destroyed the ecology of the forests here. He destroyed the economy, and he literally extirpated from the community a whole class of workers. So what we do, moving towards sustainability, is a different path as a rural area than from the highly urbanized and suburbanized Marin County area. So what's happening is, I think, since I don't come across as a person with ideology, that I come across as a community organizer, which is what I am. I saved veterans' lives. 3 homeless people were saved by a homeless shelter I organized 4 years ago. 2 of them were Vietnam War veterans. I'm not a partisan in that regard. I'm not just trying to organize progressive Democrats like Norman Solomon is. I'm trying to organize the entire community. I expect that I'm going to have a lot of Republicans who are going to vote for me, because I am talking about revitalizing local economies. I like small businesses, sole proprietorships, co-ops, probably ESOPs, and these other ways of organizing the community. I'm talking about revitalizing the economy. There's nothing, leftist about that. If people can pay their mortgages and their health care is taken care of, and they've got good transportation and all the rest of it, then everybody's better. We have a more secure community. A lot of other social problems disappear. As people were laid off from Pacific Lumber Company, you just watch the numbers of alcoholism and violence and crime and drug abuse, and all the rest of it goes up. Likewise, if you start to move towards wellness in a community, start taking care of things, those things go down.
You're watching Sentinel Interviews. This is Charles Douglas with Andy Caffrey, a candidate, in fact the only candidate from Humboldt County, running for the new 2nd Congressional District, covering the North Coast all the way from the Oregon border to the Golden Gate Bridge. We were talking about Fortuna, what's missing there in terms of the timber jobs. That's true, of course, across Humboldt, Trinity, Del Norte, Mendocino counties. What's also missing around Fortuna especially, and up and down the Eel River Valley where I guess you could say you live, as far as being in that watershed in southern Humboldt and Garberville, is the water. And that what struck me the most about the new geography of the new North Coast Congressional District is the water divide. And that's something that was set up long before Huffman or Thompson or Riggs or any of these people. Over 100 years ago, I think it was Chinese labor that hand-dug a tunnel to steal half the Eel River water through the Potter Valley project and feed it down to the wineries and the agriculture and the huge sprawling cities in Sonoma and Marin counties. Do you see that as the essential divide in this district, is who's donating the water and thus the prosperity that flows with it, and who's receiving that?
Well, I think the Marin and Sonoma County candidates are going to have to address this. They haven't addressed it before. Up here, we've known it was a problem, forever. When I moved up here in 1988, I'd heard about the diversion of the water from the Eel. Well, going back to what I'm talking about in terms of a move towards sustainability, that means that you can't have that water diverted down into Sonoma and Marin anymore, because the fish need it. We need to revitalize our ecosystems. So we're not just keeping species from going extinct, but we want them to flourish. We want our forests to flourish. We want our rivers to flourish. So Marin and Sonoma County are going to have to figure out how to deal with less water. I mean, in Tucson, oh boy, that was maybe 15 years ago, they passed a law banning the English lawn in new home construction. So people didn't have lawns that they had to water. And maybe Marin's going to have to move in that direction. I don't know. But I think it's an interesting opportunity because there is this conflict between urban America and rural America. And as the congressman for both of those types of America within our own district, it's going to be a challenge to see how do we work together to make this thing happen for everybody. And I'm up for that task. I have several videos where you can see me and how I relate to law enforcement officers. And in fact, there's a scene in the new Judy Berry documentary, Who Bombed Judy Berry, in which a law enforcement officer comes up to me. And I basically charm him out of his threatening ways. So I found that most Republicans tend to see the Eagle Scout in me. And I take advantage of that because I genuinely like everybody. Even people I have problems with in terms of difficulties in our lives, I still respect the inner dignity of every human being. And that's how I come at all of this. So when I look at the Middle East, for example, yeah, I have views on various things that have been done politically by the government of Israel or Palestinians, but essentially I look at the 99% of the people who are suffering there. And that's where I start when I look for what would we do for the Middle East. I can't give you an answer for what we do to solve the problems in the Middle East, but I can tell you that that's my orientation.
Well, closer to home, you hear some conservative voices talk about those greedy growers, and only if they were paying their fair share, and even some liberal voices now saying those growers, they're despoiling the environment and ruining watersheds. And I'm tempted to agree with them, of course. The greedy growers I have in mind aren't the pot growers, they're the wine growers. And if you look at who's wasting more water and who's spreading more poisons in the environment, it's no contest. And that's what we've seen with the incumbent and with perhaps the incumbent's handpicked successor is a real fealty to that industry. And you've seen that in terms of the campaign donations and when Mike Thompson was in the state legislature as well as in Congress, pushing to push back the bans on methyl bromide, which was a toxic pesticide that poisons the groundwater and kills the farm workers, destroys the ozone layer, the Montreal Protocol, an international treaty that the U.S. actually tried to follow for once, tried to ban that worldwide, and literally because wine growers in the North Coast wanted to keep spraying methyl bromide, we pushed back the ban on that. Where do you come down on how to deal with the growers who are doing these things?
Well, everybody has to come up with a sustainability plan. They may have a few more years of this directed water, but they're going to have to become sustainable. And it's also true about marijuana. I mean, just because marijuana is grown doesn't mean it's grown well. There are ecological ways of growing wine or marijuana, but sometimes it means you can't grow them in every area you want to grow them. Sometimes you can't grow them to create the volume that allows you to sell your wine at a low price so that you can compete on the market. It may be that just wine is a more expensive product because it's grown in a more ecological way and it doesn't get free water and it doesn't have the petrochemicals anymore for the fungicides and herbicides and the rest of that. So as far as the fish or the grapes, I come down on the side of the fish. I've been an Earth First organizer since 1985, and the reason I'm an Earth Firster is because we have to look at the impact first on the ecosystem. If you're going to degrade the ecosystem, then you don't do that. So my bumper sticker has fish on it, so everybody knows that I'm with the fish.
So besides being with the fish, what would you say sets you apart from the other candidates? You said there's about a dozen of them. I don't think I could name them all fast.
Well, in addition to my being the only candidate who has lived and worked in all 6 counties of the district, and the fact that I live in a town of 2,000 people and they live in the San Francisco Bay Area, so everyday experience of life is different between us. I would say it's the perception of the climate crisis. I'm a top percentile math person on the SAT, and I look at this climate crisis and say, how much time do we have and how much change do we have to make? And I've been looking at it that way for 30 years. The other people tend to look at it as, well, it's out there, and then here's the government and the budgets of the government over here. I'm going to go in there and see if I can move it towards a direction of taking care of that problem. But there's never any measurable test. Is that going to be enough? President Obama says we have until 2050 to reduce our emissions 80%. But in 1990, the EPA, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the Woods Hole Research Center issued reports saying that we had to reduce our emissions 50 to 80% by 2005 to stabilize the climate. And we did nothing except increase our CO2. So now, we still have until 2005, as far as I'm concerned. We didn't get any more time. In fact, the science since 1990 has shown that those were underestimations of how much change we had to make in our society to basically save our necks and save the function of our ecosystems and really the civilization of humanity.
Well, one of your opponents, Dan Roberts, at that Fortuna High School debates, tried to cast some doubt on that, saying he wasn't clear on what science had as a foolproof answer on that.
Well, there's your answer right there. He said he wasn't clear on what the science had. Well, he should do his homework and get clear on what the science says.
But have we really seen dramatic sea level rises as was predicted back in 1990 at this point?
Well, what I've studied since 1995 is the history of the ice ages. And I say ages because the last 2.1 million years has been the thing called the Ice Age, but it goes through these cycles where it's in a glacial period, which is what we tend to think of when we think of an ice age, which lasts for about 100,000 years, and then it goes into a warmer period like the one we're in now, which is an interglacial. And so what we've seen by looking at ice cores going back 2.1 million years is that CO2 levels never got above 290 parts per million. Now we're at 390 parts per million. In fact, during that 2.1 million years, it oscillated mostly from 280 parts per million down to 170 parts per million. That's a range of 110 degrees, 110 parts per million. Now we've gone from that 280 to 390, so we've increased it another 110%. So now the oscillation is twice the order of magnitude it was previously. That's a change that can threaten the whole system. So further, as we go back and look at the changes that have occurred going into and out of interglacials, we find these rapid periods where sea level goes up. 120,000 years ago, they don't know the cause of it, but they do know that something happened and sea level went up 20 feet and then from there plummeted at least 50 feet in a century. That's a 70-foot change over 100 years. That's a foot a year almost. You look now what's happening with Greenland and West Antarctica, and you see that if Greenland goes, that causes a 20-foot sea level increase. If West Antarctica goes, that would cause a 20-foot sea level increase. So I think what's happened in the past is that these ice ages have been triggered when the natural greenhouse effect causes this destabilization to happen in Greenland and West Antarctica, and it causes that sea level increase. And when those ice sheets are broken up as much as they are, they act as rings holding back more ice. And since that's gone, that ice flows out, and you have the opposite of what we're experiencing in the Arctic. Right now, the Arctic is getting darker because of the ice melting. But at the south end of the planet, what you would have is an expansion of the ice. And so it would reflect more of the sun's energy off of the planet, and that would cause us to go into an ice age. So it's not about a gradual increase that we can see. We do know that sea level is going up, but on the level of centimeters. But there are these thresholds, and that's why we won't know. We won't get a warning. But when I look at the maps, and I have a brand new TV commercial that's going to start airing this week in Humboldt and Del Norte counties, you can see it yourself. It shows that the ice sheet of Greenland, the border which has water underneath, has expanded inward, and about half of it is sitting on like a slip and slide. Okay? The whole thing's not going to go at once, but even if a 20th of it went over a couple of years, that's a foot increase. That's enough to wipe out much of Eureka, Arcata, Sausalito, San Rafael, Crescent City. Okay? Once you do that, it's too late for those places. Look at New Orleans, look at the Gulf Coast. It has not come back. If New Orleans was like Las Vegas, now it's like Reno. That's what's happened, and I think that these are conditions that people can recognize. I can point to New Orleans now. It used to be in forestry, when we were trying to prevent logging, we could point to clear cuts and say, isn't that horrible? But we didn't have something like that for the climate issue. You had to get into the science and the math of the whole thing, and you had to look at natural variability and try to figure out, how much is the natural variability going back millions of years. Are we going way beyond what it's done, or are we within those tolerances? Now we can see the massive changes taking place on the planet. You had an area the size of Texas on fire in Australia, and an area even larger, was it France and Spain, that was flooded. These are massive, these are nation-destroying natural events that we're starting to have. People starved because of the fires that were in Russia a couple of years ago. I think it reduced their crop output 30%. Well, what happens if we lose the growing seasons in the Central Valley? Whole nations depend upon the food that's produced from the Central Valley of California. So I think that this is not a political issue. I'm going in to affect it politically, but I think this is an issue the American people can get behind. And so my congressional campaign is about building that movement that is going to basically surround the people who are in Congress now and pressure them to move in the direction I'm talking about. And we can see right now in this campaign, there are at least 4 of the other candidates who have moved in my direction on the climate issue. Susan Adams is now talking about how she thinks that we can get the residential properties of the 2nd District off fossil fuels entirely in 10 years. Tiffany Renee, Dr. Courtney, they're also talking about this. So I think that because what I'm saying is reasonable, I'm a compassionate man who cares about all people, that I can get beyond some of the sectarianism in Congress. But the part that can't, the Republicans who won't change, we're going to get rid of those people. We're going to organize, and those people are going to be gone. And we're going to start putting our people in. That's the name of the game. And then we cross the threshold politically where we have enough control and enough of the American people behind us to go in this new direction towards a new green America.
But politically, I think people can perhaps see some of the long-term consequences of a broken electoral system or ecological crises that are unfolding, deforestation, genetic modification, and so forth. But to someone who's sitting at home who's underemployed or unemployed, what are we telling them? What are you telling them in terms of what hope they have in the political system? How are they going to get a job? How are they going to get health care?
Well, using the old economic model, as I said with that graph that goes up and down with the 1% and the rest of us, to generally stimulate this economy and create jobs, you have to put money back into the middle class. It's because people don't have money to spend that jobs aren't being created. You can't start, there isn't even, I was reading recently from James Galbraith, there isn't even a theory of supply-side job creation. It just doesn't happen. You don't put money into something and suddenly people come into your store. If they don't have money, they're not going to do that. So in a general sense, to create your next job, we have to get money redirected from the rich, from the military, from the war on drugs, back into the middle class and to the poor. And what you'll see then is an increase in the overall wealth of the middle class and the poor. Now what I'm proposing is that that stimulus be towards building a new green infrastructure, and that the jobs then be related to that. So what I am talking about is the greatest jobs program the United States has ever seen. So my proposal will create more jobs by far than millionaire Stacey Lawson or the Assemblyman Jared Huffman and all of the programs that they're talking about.
You're watching Sentinel Interviews here on Access Humboldt Channel 12 and on the World Wide Web. I'm Charles Douglas, here with Andy Caffrey, Humboldt County's only resident running for the new North Coast congressional seat. Again, the primary election is on June 5th, and the top 2 candidates will go to a November general election, the same election where President Obama will be facing the voters. Where do you come down on national politics? Do you think this president has earned your vote for another term?
No, of course not. But we don't have a choice. Obama is going to be the next president. We're not going to be able to get a Green. We're not going to be able to get a better Democrat. It's just signed, sealed, and delivered to us. So I would encourage people to vote for Greens, or if they're of other political stripes, Libertarian, vote for those candidates.
But isn't that the same lesser of two evil thinking that's telling people, well, you'd better vote for Jared Huffman or you're going to get Dan Roberts?
By telling people to vote for the Greens?
Well, couldn't they make the same argument why they shouldn't vote for you or for Norman Solomon or for Susan Adams or for Tiffany Renee or for Dr. Courtney? Well, you don't want to vote for them, or you're going to deny the establishment Democrats your votes, and then the establishment Republican is going to get in there. I mean, isn't that the same logic?
Well, first of all, the Republicans have only run psychopaths so far. Every single one of the Republicans that are running for president literally meet the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder, as do all 41 Republican senators.
Are you saying that just because of their foreign policy and support for war?
No, no. Their absolute lack of sensitivity to the suffering of others is one of them. Their pathological lying is another one. Their lack of taking responsibility for the problems that they've created. That's 3 of the 7. Just meeting those 3, they meet the criteria, and they meet several others. No, I'm saying it because we have to recognize what we're confronting. It's not about, Susan Adams says she has a healing background and she's going to go into Congress to heal them. I think that's a joke. I have a healing orientation and training too, and I work on that on a one-to-one basis with homeless people, and on a community level I try to do that.
Well, I think
but
most
that's
people,
not the way to do things federally.
Most people would say D.C. is a pretty sick place. Right?
Yeah, and these guys are literally monsters. We have to see them as monsters, and what you have to do is you have to pressure them. You have to basically threaten the foundation that keeps them in power. And we can do that by community organizing on a large scale. I would love to see Occupy expand out and start to focus on taking out these Republicans and the conservatives, the blue dogs, and the rest of them. Because it's the only game in town. I mean, if you care about any of the things I mentioned in this New Green America set of proposals, or anything else in your life, it's all under threat. And if you actually care about it, if you actually love your kids and want them to have some kind of a wonderful life for the length of their lifespan, then you only got one choice now in terms of major political work, and that is we have to get control of the federal government. And we can't do it on the presidential level, and we can't do it on the Supreme Court level, because those things are controlled by the elite. But we can organize among 700,000 people in a congressional district. That is something people can do. You can look to our history, the organization of the organized labor movement, the birth of that. These were organizing projects on the scale I'm talking about. Now, in my case, what I need is to organize about 40,000 voters out of that 700,000. So it's not even about organizing most of them or all of them. It's about being strategic in how we do that. And so I encourage all Greens to start to take advantage of my campaign and how it publicizes green politics to do what we should have been doing a long time ago, which is let's create the green vision for our American friends to get inspired by the way we've been inspired by it. But they haven't seen it. So let's get out of our little process meetings and go out in the neighborhoods and start showing them Ecotopia.
Well, as far as those humane values, while many folks might share them, they might look at the federal government. They might look at the nightmare of healthcare reform that merely forces people to buy a defective insurance product that they can't afford, or get fined money they can't pay, or be prosecuted for tax evasion, I assume. Isn't it arguable that a local or a state government would be a better level to solve these problems with? Is it really anything but laughable to say that the education system in America or here locally has gotten better since the federal government increased its role in education?
Well, it's about the corporatists in the federal government doing that. That's why we have to replace those people. You can't change those people. That is their paradigm.
But why wouldn't you just deprive them of the power to interfere with our educational system locally instead of pretending that we can get them to reform their ways?
Well, again, the bottom line is the climate crisis. When Bush was installed, there were a number, I think maybe it's up to 1,000 governors and mayors, local and state level officials who got together to try to figure out ways that they could initiate the reduction of fossil fuels on their own without the federal government. But unfortunately, they're using essentially President Obama's time frame, 80% reduction by 2050. It's about a third of what we need. And I'll tell you something, if the East Coast is flooded because Greenland breaks up, all these other issues become moot. You don't have to worry about senior care if there aren't any seniors because they've been flooded. So the climate crisis becomes a central organizing principle for everything else that we're doing. I'm a minimalist, however. I'm not a person who wants to come in and change everybody's lives. I want to make the least change in people's lives possible that gets the job done. But I want to do the changes that get the job done. So I'm not a moralist. I'm not telling anybody they are jerks because they haven't been behind green politics. Hey, we have a situation now we're dealing with. We need everybody. This is about working together. This is about taking care of each other. And just because the system is broken, I mean, you can have a broken bicycle, doesn't mean you can't make it work. And what I'm talking about is starting a little fire with kindling, keeping that going, and then allowing that to expand outward. And nowadays, I mean, think about it. My election on, let's say, $30,000 over millionaires, over the assemblyman, would cause headlines everywhere around the world. People go, how could this Earth First guy who was homeless, who has PTSD, get elected in the United States against millionaires? People would start to look at that model. And then I think you'd find people starting to organize. And I think we would see the change happen surprisingly quickly. It's not something that would happen 10 years from now. It's something that would happen 2 years and 4 years from now. And so we would have a battle for our federal government. I mean, we have to psychologically become rebels. We have to realize that these are enemies. You don't have to hate the Democrats and Republicans individually, but you have to realize that they are our enemies just as much as Japan was or Germany was in World War II. And you have to basically remove them. You have to get that job done. And we have to get our people in. That is what has to be done. You know, you've been involved in green politics for a long time. You know that we have all kinds of solutions for a lot of these problems. And as you were suggesting, a lot of this should be dealt with at the state and community level. And that's what my process is about. It's about redirecting the control over our economy, over our society, to local control. Again, I'm just calling for the feds to fund it.
Well, you're talking about things kind of falling off the cliff under the Bush regime and so forth, but as far as a policy of debasing the currency, that began under Nixon. As far as trade policies, which deindustrialized the country and shipped our job overseas, that was GATT, and then NAFTA, and then WTO. That was already heavily accelerated under Clinton. So again, is it just purging the Republicans because they're the enemy and they're like the Nazis? How does that solve those larger issues that have been endemic in our political culture for decades?
No, it's the only hope for the Democratic Party at all is how many people on the grassroots level who call themselves Democrats respond to the message I'm talking about. The Democratic Party as an institution that's going to make this change is hopeless. I'm doing it now as a Democrat because the only way we're going to see third parties get in there is if some people who are essentially from third parties can get in another way and start to get the electoral laws changed so that a lot of these barriers to third party success are reduced enough so that someone running as a registered Green or a registered Libertarian can actually get elected from those parties if they win the will of enough people. And I guess that's it.
Well, that's a lot. What is your path to victory, though? If everybody in Humboldt County voted for you, we're still a minority compared to the coastal slice of Sonoma and Marin. How are you going to get to those voters?
Well, considering how little I've done outside of the group campaign context, the debates and such, I have 6%. 6% of the vote, without hardly any money at all. What's happened is we have, here in the 4 northern counties, very little media diversity like you have in the Bay Area. So a lot more people listen to KMUD, KHUM, KHSU, or watch the handful of TV stations that we have. So it's a lot easier to reach a lot more people using that media, plus it's a lot more cheap. I'm starting to air advertisements next week. I'm going to air over 20 ads next week because it's so cheap here, and it's going to reach every television in Del Norte and Humboldt County. So our district is unique, and because of that, because of the marijuana community, because of the history of all these environmental people who've come here, we can organize that 40,000 people, and it's happening now. My bumper stickers are on more cars around here than anybody else's, and there's a lot more word of mouth going on now. We have, it's wonderful how many debates that we've had. I've been in debates that have gone on cable access and internet and broadcast on the radio, and been in front of over 1,000 progressive Democrats so far. So we can hear, the name of the game is, can we figure out ways to reach as many people? And it's not like one way. I have a history as a community organizer, so a normal person couldn't just come in without that experience and disseminate their campaign through that grassroots network. I can do that, though. And I also have a background in computer and video work, still photography and journalism, so I can also take on making my own television commercials, which is what I've done. And I have a huge advantage. I can take advantage of super cheap rates and come out with a new commercial every week. The other candidates have to spend maybe $10,000, $20,000, $50,000 to produce one, plus they're going to be kind of anal retentive about it and want everything to be perfect. You know, because of the commercials up here, we're used to sort of ragtag stuff. We watch cable access. You know, none of this stuff is perfectly produced. So my ads are going to be reaching people, and none of the other candidates' ads are going to reach them for at least a month. So I'm sure that there are situations like that in places like Boulder, Colorado, or Burlington, Vermont, or Berkeley area, Portland, Eugene, where they could do the same kind of thing, especially if they have a leader who's got a more stronger reputation, a positive name recognition among a larger number of people than I have down here.
Again, you've been watching Sentinel Interviews. I'm Charles Douglas, and I'd like to thank my guest, Andy Caffrey, a Southern Humboldt resident who's running among 12 other candidates for the North Coast congressional seat. The election is on June 5th, and your deadline to register to vote is May 21st. Andy, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Charles. Thanks, everybody.